Hello. Fighting Fantasy, the original game books in the 1980s, were my first introduction to the tabletop gaming hobby. I got my first book in 1983. It was the Citadel of Chaos, which I still have. I've had it signed by Livingston and Jackson and Russ Nicholson, which I'm very happy about. I've got lots of stuff signed by all of them, a lot of people actually. Yeah, it was the first gaming related thing that I ever got my hands on, and I absolutely loved it. I was absorbed by that. I went back and bought Warlock of Farsight Mountain, and then continued on with City of Thieves, Death Trap Dungeon, and Starship Traveller, which I'm also a big fan of. And I absolutely loved them. It wasn't until 1984 that I got into tabletop role playing through the Red Box Dungeons and Dragons basic set. But it was the Fighting Fantasy was the very first game that I got involved with, the very first system. So the 2d6 roll and skill, stamina, luck. And I then, when I first started, let me just grab it here. When I first started GMing, because I wanted to cut my teeth on GMing and not worry about the rules and do something that I know. Of course, I was playing a lot of the original Fighting Fantasy role-playing game, and yeah, I took bits and bobs out of this, especially for the magic rules as well. For those games, I had a fantastic time doing it. But the books mean a lot to me. The only fantasy world that I knew at that point was Tolkien's Middle Earth, and I dabbled with Narnia. But Titan, the Fighting Fantasy world, and especially Elancia, it was the first full-on fantasy world that I got really deeply involved with, because I was exploring it through the books, through the game books. And then when Titan, the Fighting Fantasy world, came out, which I've got here, and basically detailed the entire fantasy world. This was the first proper sort of campaign book that I actually bought, with that wonderful Christos Achilleos cover, and my pride and joy of my collection, to be honest with you, because I can't really see very well there. I got loads of people, including Christos Achilleos himself, to sign the book. This was an absolute revelation. Mark Gascoigne wrote an absolutely belting book. Well, edited, I should say, an absolutely belting book. There are details in here which really helped give my games a lot of depth. The history and the maps was all laid out, so I had loads of places to play, so I wasn't just restricted to what was happening in the game books. And yeah, absolutely stunning stuff. Really enjoyed it. Towards the late 80s, early 90s, the book started to wind down, and I started to drift away from Fighting Fantasy, because I was playing D&D, and then I was playing Mer, but then Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I think a part of me kind of looked at it thinking, well, I've done that, and that's part of my childhood. Maybe there was part of me thinking it was a little bit childish. And it is. I mean, at the end of the day, it is written for young adults and kids. But I think, and that's what gives it its charm. You know what I mean? It's kind of irreverent. It's got a little bit of silly British humour, and some parts of it can be quite dark. I mean, some of the illustrations in the early books, especially, were quite haunting. Extremely well done. Absolutely love the art in all the books. Some of the book covers were absolutely stunning. Especially Forest of Doom. Forest of Doom, the original book cover for that was absolutely fantastic, and that's what drew me into the game. The visuals, the fact that I was in control of the adventure, and all the interior illustrations given that book and that location life. Absolutely fantastic. So that kind of primed me for role playing, because of course I was restricted to the choices that the book gave me. Of course, I was making up stories in my head, and I actually created a character which was going through the different adventures. And they didn't actually die in that; they just got knocked unconscious and then tried again. So I was used to the concept of stories and of choice, and of characters, and of the rules of a rule system. So that was the perfect primer. So when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons a year later, yes, it took me a little while to get my head around the fact that I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. I was no longer limited by the choices in the book. But yeah, I was ready for it. I was ready for it, ready and primed to go. Another one of my favourite books was Out of the Pit. Again, this is an original copy. Absolutely fantastic. And this was invaluable when I was running my Fighting Fantasy games. And for a long time, even in the last few years, I've used this book, this little paperback book, to introduce people to the tabletop role-playing hobby with various levels of success. I mean, they've always moved on from Fighting Fantasy, but Fighting Fantasy to me was just brilliant because it was simple, it was intuitive. I knew it inside out. I knew the world inside out, so it was very easy for me to sort of communicate that passion to new players, and it was easier for them because it was a nice simple system, so they could get used to the idea of role playing, and then hopefully move on to bigger games, or move on to Advanced Fight Fantasy, which was the role playing game that came out later from ARION Games. So yeah, it was an absolutely huge part of my childhood. So when I grew up, and a few years ago, I was getting into games design because I wasn't really in that many games, so I was spending a lot of time writing and sort of designing. I still want to be sort of involved in the hobby somehow. And then that's when I wrote The Floating Dungeon of Arak Azlur, and I pitched it to ARION Games, and they said, yeah, we'll publish it. So an official adventure for the official Fight Fantasy role-playing game. So as an adult, I was excited because this was my first chance to get involved in tabletop gaming design, and the child in me was squealing at the top of his fucking voice because I had finally got to a point where I could pitch material to the thing that I grew up with that got me started in the tabletop gaming hobby. And then when they also agreed to allow me to illustrate it as well, so I did my own illustrations. Well, I mean, that was just the cream on the cake. A lot of these artists in the old books were artists that I looked up to, that I admired, and they were my peers, and they were just stunning artists. And I'm not a professional artist. The artwork that I do purely for personal pleasure or as fillers. But I really tried hard to get this art right, and I was quite pleased with it. It was actually translated into French recently by Scriptarium, part of this book. Sadly, I don't speak French, which is a massive fault. Peril dans le Conseil des Titans. I have no idea if I pronounced that right. I probably just insulted some poor French bloke's mother. But absolutely stunning artwork in here. And my story, The Floating Dungeon of Arak Azlur, is in here. I can't remember which page it's on. Here we are. And we had an entire new artist redo the artwork, and did an absolutely stunning job. So, but the adventure's the same, just translated into French, of course. So, and they did a fantastic job. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Looks absolutely fantastic. I should learn French. I'd love to see this in English because the adventures in here look absolutely fantastic. The artwork is absolutely stunning. So yeah, I was happy with that. And then I went on and did some more adventures for them, as well as write the first half or the character creation section of Stellar Adventures, which is the science fiction version. Because I love the science fiction books for Fight Fantasy, starting with Traveller and then through Rings of Kether and Space Assassin and all that lot. So I wanted to write a science fiction version of the book, of the Fight Fantasy book. And I started it, and ARION Games were fine with it, and sadly I had to pull out the project for reasons. But a year later, Graham Botley at ARION Games actually finished the entire book and got it released. And it looks great, and it was nice to see my name on the front cover of the book. That was really, really cool. So that was another win for the Hicks. So I write a few more adventures for them, and I'm actually thinking about doing another one now. I'm mulling over the idea of writing a new adventure for Fight Fantasy, because I do wish I carried on doing that. But it basically gave me my first taste of game design, both writing and art. And to think that I have created a little section of Alancia, which I grew up with, and there's a little area there and a little kingdom, or a little realm there, which is mine, which I've put in there. It's fantastic feeling, absolutely wonderful. So yeah, I'm really, really happy with it. So, but yeah, Fighting Fantasy, it was my go-to game for a nice simple game. And it's my go-to game to introduce people to the hobby. And when I was a kid, it was just my go-to game. So when I wasn't playing Dungeons and Dragons or whatever I was playing at the time, I'd be sat up in bed playing a Fighting Fantasy game book. And I've got nearly all of them. I've got loads of the reprints. I've got loads of the role-playing stuff. I've got loads of the other stuff. There's pencils and official dice and the Death Trap Dungeon, the video game card game. A lot of it's signed because I'm a massive nerd. Hey. And so yeah, I'm a massive fan of Fight Fantasy. So you can pick up a lot of the older books quite cheap in different places, and I would highly suggest if you can get hold of that, because this is a great introduction to the hobby. It really, really is. It takes you through the steps of the game as if you're the director of a movie, and it sort of explains things, which is great, because then you've got the actors and the players, and then the part actors are the NPCs, and it talks you how to describe a scene, which is like describing the area. Really, really good. The analogy is really, really good. So yeah, I felt that was a great benefit to me when I first started GMing. So yeah, so that's me and Fight Fantasy. I'll put some links to ARION Games in the description below. So I think I've got 4 adventures with them at the moment, apart from the rule book. And he did one called Demons of Doom, which Graham asked me to illustrate about 5 or 6 demons for that, which I did, and he's put in. So I'm in that book with loads of other artists who I look up to, who I admire, and it's just thrilling. I think I'm blowing my own trumpet a little bit because I'm just honestly thrilled to be part of the Fighting Fantasy lineage of the Fighting Fantasy history, and it's just what I grew up with, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, so that entire video was part me getting excited about Fighting Fantasy and me blowing my own trumpet. So well done me. So anyway, I think that's about it really. So thanks for listening. Ta-ra.